Now, South Korea's economy may be on the path to a speedy recovery from the fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Bank of Korea said Tuesday that the country's annual gross domestic product shrank 1% last year, marking the first contraction in 22 years. But it managed to post positive growth figures for the second half of 2020 after dipping to as low as minus 3.2% in the second quarter after the pandemic broke out. As South Korea took swift action to contain the virus and benefited largely from the surge of global demand for semiconductor chips, the country was able to minimize the economic fallout from the virus to the smallest margin seen among 11 advanced economies. The International Monetary Fund now predicts South Korea's GDP will grow 3.1% this year, an upward revision from its previous outlook of 2.9%. And combined with growth in 2020, this would mark the highest growth rate seen among major economies. Today, we discuss what's needed to prop up the numbers and whether this growth is sustainable. I'm joined by Troy Stangerone, Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute of America. It's great to see you again. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me on again.
We also have Oh Jun-seok, Business Professor at Sookmyung University in Seoul. Thank you very much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with you, Dr. Stangerone. Now, South Korea managed to post positive growth figures in the second half of 2020. So many are expecting Korea to make a steady recovery. But do you think Korea will be able to continue this growth trajectory in 2021 and beyond? Or do you think the growth that we saw last year was a rather temporary phenomenon that might have been caused by the impact of the pandemic on other major economies?
Well, I think what we saw in 2020 was actually a very good growth number for South Korea. The final number ended up a slight bit better than projections were in mid-year. I think going into 2021 this year, you're going to see good growth. But the question, as you said, is can this be maintained? And I think, in the long run, you have issues like demographics, productivity, that we're going to have to see the productivity gains from COVID-19 passing and the virus and the return to normal life. Once that is done, I think, Korea will go back to its normal growth patterns. So I would expect 2021 strong growth, maybe strong growth into early 2022, but then perhaps a return to normal projections.
And Dr. Oh, now, South Korea's GDP growth in 2020 was also largely attributed to the sale of semiconductors. But of course, the last few years have proven that we can't rely on memory chips alone, as the global demand for semiconductors largely affects the Korean economy as a whole. Is there a need to move away from chips or diversify our key export items in going forward?
Great question, Suyang. On the way to my university these days, I made a daily habit of counting empty business and shut down restaurants from subway station to the campus. It is true that Korea managed to make its way through even on the COVID-19 outbreak in 2020. 10th global ranking of GDP, minus 1% of GDP growth, minus 1% of export growth, according to Bank of Korea. This is mainly because the global economy has been recovering since last summer, with exports growing, gaining momentum of growth. Therefore, the Korean economy can get resilience from the bottom of the economy. They say unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic this year resulted in the biggest global economic slump since World War II, and Korea was no exception. Government expenditure and expansionary fiscal policy could hardly, barely hold on this outcome. The number, though domestic consumption evaporated in the market. It is likely a stretch that the OECD predict the global economy bouncing back with 4% growth this year. No wonder economic recovery is expected to accelerate even once vaccines and results treatments are available in 2021. Korean economic growth rate is expected to be likely rise 2.8% this year. As Soo-young pinpointed, that there cast a concern that the dependency on electronics and semiconductor in export has reached up to 38% of total export volume. It should have been diversified in the sense of continuity and sustainability. Finding out opportunity, public sector and private sector cooperation is needed. Public sector forecast global demand for shipbuilding might be on the rise due to resurgent international trade. Global projects in the construction sector will move forward. Korean prepare for a New Deal focusing on granted a New Deal, $133 billion worth of investment will be made by 2025. In addition, when it comes to private sector, mobility, cosmetics, biotechnology, and healthcare sectors are paid attention in the current capital market.
So it really needs the contribution of both the public and private sector to really continue this growth. And as you said, looking for other opportunities as well as more opportunities in construction or shipbuilding. And well, Dr. Stenggren, one of the major factors that was cited for driving recovery or a better performance of the Korean economy last year was the country's initially fast response to the pandemic in early 2020. However, nowadays, South Korea is falling behind in terms of rolling out a wide-scale vaccination. Are there any economic risks to this?
I think there are. What we're seeing is that countries who have to go into lockdown, who have to restrict activities, see deeper economic declines. South Korea has been able to perform as well because of its contract tracing program, its ability to take and keep the virus under control in a relative sense, and to minimize the shutdowns that you've seen in the United States and Europe and other places. But what we're also seeing as the United States and Europe try to push out the vaccinations is that this is a slow process. It's going slower than many people expected. In the European Union, today there were calls to take and have the EU provide the right for national governments to not allow the export of vaccines from their country so as to take and get Europeans vaccinated first. This is going to be a challenge because, for example, the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, one of its production facilities is in Germany, if I remember correctly. And so if you were to have this cut off, that would then slow it down to distribution to other places like South Korea, which means it would take longer to take and vaccinate the populations there. And this is an increased risk because we're starting to see new variants of the virus come out. The British variant, which is more contagious, the South African variant, and the Brazilian variants, which the vaccines are still effective against, but are less effective against. And so there's a risk that the longer this process takes as well, that you end up with a more dangerous variant that requires an adjustment to the vaccine process as well. So all of this has sort of follow-on economic risks that if a deeper outbreak were to occur in South Korea, that could then have deeper economic impacts.
And Dr. Stenggren, another major risk factor for South Korea has always been the global trading environment, as it is a very export-dependent economy and it does react very sensitively to the global trade conditions. And for the last few years, it suffered from the rise of protectionist policies around the world, including your country, of course, in the US. And now with President Biden taking office, well, he's made it quite clear that he's not going to be focusing on trade just yet. He's got domestic priorities. But he also aims to ramp up production at home once he starts looking into the economy and rolling out the second part of his Great America Rescue Plan. So do you think that, there is concern that once that happens, Joe Biden might retain some of Trump's protectionist policies or not digress so much from the policies we've seen in the past? Do you see a danger of doing that?
So I think, as you noted,
please go ahead, Dr. Stenggren.
As you noted, President Biden has said that he wants to focus on the domestic economy first. So I think during this first year, you're not likely to see much adjustment in trade policy. You're actually maybe to see more of a focus, not just on the Buy America plans, which he's recently signed an executive order, but also basically trade enforcement. But that being said, in the fall, in probably November or so, he'll be going to the APEC meetings, he'll be going to the ASEAN meetings, something that President Trump had not done. And there will be pressure building at that point, I think, for him to start looking into a more proactive trade policy. But in the short term, I wouldn't expect to see much change. Look at policies right now. You're talking about situations where, for example, there's more emphasis on American-made content, closing loopholes to foreign content, limiting the types of waivers that have allowed foreign content to be used in these types of construction projects in the United States. The government procurement in the United States accounts for about $600 billion a year, so it's a fairly significant amount. So for Korean companies that do not have facilities in the United States, they could see themselves, looking on the outside in on these types of contracts as the Biden administration tries to take and rebuild the U.S. economy.
And Dr. Rowe, how do you see the risk of the Biden administration possibly retaining protectionist policies, and how do you think Korean businesses should prepare?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but the Biden administration takes different style and approaches for the sake of mutual respect and interest, I suppose. Basically, there remains a lot in common trade policy between the two administrations. As Biden administration comes back to multilateralism, which implies keeping international standard in the process of dispute settlement understanding. They will keep the stand of hardliners against China, against the EU, pushing reshoring inducement so far, at least the trade policy is concerned. As a result, trade tension will continue. Even the Biden administration, there comes an announcement that quite recently, Biden administration has a plan to purchase electronic cars made in the United States only. Korean companies have to reform and reconfigure global value chain in the wake of COVID-19 shock. Not only the efficiency of global value chain, but it should be considered in their decision resilience trade, resilience global value chain, business development for a global partnership, and localizing business network in the sense of creating shared prosperity. Without this global impact consideration, as a result of COVID-19, we know that trade tension will evoke government intervention fully equipped with protectionism, not to mention of populism. One more thing to count in is a trade war could be easily transformed into currency war. According to OECD, the economic impact of COVID-19 has heightened market risk aversion and volatility of equity and oil have spiked to crisis levels. This hardened turmoil in global financial markets is likely to occur. So the Korean companies have to consider these things in consideration in their decision making.
And Dr. Stangrain, well, as a part of South Korea's recovery plan from COVID-19, President Moon last year launched the country's green and digital New Deals as a means of generating new growth engines. But many say that some aspects of the deals are rather shallow, as they are admittedly top-down and they pour millions and millions into creating public sector jobs and might lack some ambition on reaching global standards, for instance, on the climate. What's your view on this, and what fundamental challenges do you think South Korea needs to overcome to make economic growth sustainable?
So I think that the Green New Deal and the Digital New Deal were important first steps, but I think we should keep it in the context of that. If you look at, for example, the Green New Deal, I think a lot of the long-term benefits for that, if it plays out, are actually going to be from the government's hydrogen roadmap, which predates the Green New Deal, and the shift to the greater use of hydrogen in the South Korean economy as an alternative resource. But if South Korea is going to, one, have a sustainable economy going forward, and two, do so in a way that creates more jobs at home, I think there are a couple of things that need to take place. One is there's going to need to be long-term buy-in by the South Korean government. And what I mean by that is President Moon will leave office in May of next year. And if the next president shifts gears and the government introduces new policies, you're not going to see these sort of nascent industries really develop and become the types of things that, one, will reduce South Korea's carbon emissions, but two, that will also take and allow the economy to grow by being dominant or being at least leading players in these types of fields. Two, I think there needs to be deeper buy-in on the business side in South Korea. Hyundai is making a strong push for electric vehicles and is going to be one of the top players potentially in the hydrogen fuel sector. But I think while there are some other Korean companies that have sort of embraced this, I think there's sort of a reluctance on the company side. But setting aside what concerns they may have about whether government policy will go this way long term, I think if we look at the international environment, with President Biden in place, clearly there's going to be more focus on a green economy. The Europeans have been focusing on this a long time. China is trying to take and dominate these types of industries. So I think the sooner that South Korean companies are able to take and really focus on trying to develop new technologies, maybe either electric-based, hydrogen-based, or other types, that's going to be the way towards having a sustainable economic growth. Because if Korea waits and we start seeing things like carbon taxes come in, which the EU has talked about, Korean companies might find themselves not only behind the technological curve, but then facing additional barriers that make it more difficult to sell their products abroad. And so I think, really embracing this is going to be important going forward.
So South Korea is making the right move at the right time, it seems. And well, Dr. Rowe, just before we go, Well, let's talk about consumption. So while the overall GDP has done better amid the pandemic, consumption levels haven't picked up dramatically. They haven't been doing so for some years. And well, can the government really bolster the local economy in a way that's concrete and sustainable?
It's a tough question. I say that economy has two engines. Main engine is market force and supplementary engine is government policy. As a main engine of market force disappeared due to COVID-19 pandemic, there remains only supplementary engine of government policy at this moment. Economic urgency made expansionary policy inevitable, pumping money into the economy, holding the minimum level of consumption, universal basic income, rescue fund for small business, and so on, at the sacrifice of market efficiency. It's all helicopter draw of money, eroding financial stability and increasing inflationary pressure in an economy. Korea's debt to GDP ratio has exceeded over 40% already. Even the financial ministry these days, they are gatekeeper of the vote. But instead of shaping the budget, it's advised to spend in sufficient sum when necessary. Now's the time to let the market move. Government can operate the supplementary engine of economy just for saving time. Government to provide a public project named the K-New Deal, and then how to finance New Deal fund. Government expenditure, expansionary policy in the name of a universal basic income is just like jumping at the cable to boost up the main engine. Turn to the market. Government to let the company recognize it's time to make a presentation, not in front of government officers, in front of global investors and projects that should be checked and tested in the market. Restoring market is eventually needed for operating virtuous economic cycle
Sorry to
on a
jump in,
continuing
but
basis.
I'm afraid, well, we've run out of time, so this is where we'll have to end the discussion. But as you said, we can't rely on short-term sort of mechanisms to take us forward.
Right.
And well, I hope we can continue this discussion at some later point. But that was Troy Stangarone, Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute of America and Oh Jun-seok Business Professor at Kookmyung Women's University in Seoul. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Pleasure is mine.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you for watching.